South Africa has sent a high-powered and highly skilled delegation to the 56th World Economic Forum. This year's sessions are held under the theme, A Spirit of Dialogue, an ideal close to South Africa's identity and strategy in engaging with its partners. The gathering is being held in a global climate of U.S. tariff tensions and less than ideal relationship between South Africa and the world's largest economy. So what should South Africa strive for this year in Davos? We're now joined by political sociologist Professor Patrick Bond, inequality researcher Thokozile Madonko, and economist Redge Nkosi. Thokozile, I want to start the conversation with you. War is incredibly profitable, at least for those whose economies are built around the military-industrial complex. And many of the developed economies seem to be configured and built in such a way. Is there any room for developing nations to make a serious contribution to the conversation about reimagining what a global economy looks like that approaches the world in undoing inequality rather than cementing and exacerbating existing inequalities?
Good evening, and good evening to the viewers and to the panelists, my fellow panelists. I think the important thing here is that there has been and there is a very strong global voice against the rise of militarism and the military-industrial complex. And there's been a huge push to move away from financing what is essentially a deeply polluting and costly, both in terms of lives of people, but also lives of animals, planets, trees, plants, trees, and so forth. So it's critical that amid the noise that we strip down and go back to the basics about what kind of world do we want to live in and how do we want to treat each other in that world. And I think that the recent Oxfam report, inequality report, is a kind of first stab. We saw last year with South Africa leading the G20 to talking about the inequality report as well, and talking about an international panel on inequality similar to the international panel on the Climate Commission, the IPCC. So it's critical that we foreground the very many voices that are saying no to war and yes to peace, and yes to a safer, more sustainable planet.
Yeah. Prof. Bond, perhaps I want you to consider the same question. The petrodollar-based global economy that seems to be fascinated by the military-industrial complex has profited tremendously from it. Is there any incentive to undo it? And do we have an idea of how to find ourselves in a post-military-industrial complex global order where economies can participate and compete meaningfully and, fairly so?
Well, thank you very much, and I agree entirely with Thoko. And Oliver, it's nice to be with you, and also my dear friend Redge. I think these are moments where the military-industrial complex and the oil industries are at their peak. For us to say, well, they're obviously in decline, there's a climate catastrophe and multipolarism. When you see what Trump just did in Venezuela and what he wants to do in Greenland, I think this World Economic Forum, with all the talk of controlling AI and inclusive AI and concern about the triple bubbles, that's the phraseology to deal with the AI excessive valuation in the stock markets, plus the bubble of cyber currencies, plus the bubble of debt in many economies. South Africa at about $175 billion foreign debt will also know that problem. Now, that means the best I think we can get out of this group in Davos, without, by the way, the famous Klaus Schwab, who has been running it since 1971, and he's really been forced out. And there's a big change in the main chair, Larry Fink from BlackRock, is a notorious private equity investor. So he's in the financial circuit, and then you have a co-chair from the pharmaceutical circuit. So I don't trust them to do anything. What I do hope happens is that the inter-imperial rivalry we're seeing between the US with the threat to invade Greenland, and that means technically Denmark, and that means NATO from the European side may have to actually defend against the US, another member of NATO, which means NATO is broken. And I hope that's sort of, let me call it a divide and conquer from the bottom up, that we would see those sort of divisions not be healed, especially when Trump comes. I think it's fairly easy to predict he will be as obnoxious and brutal and not just paleo-conservative and as you said, protectionist, but also neoconservative, military, aggressive, hungry for more oil, and in Greenland, the rare earth minerals. This could be an explosive week. Hopefully, Europe doesn't back down. Hopefully, we have some serious confrontations and Donald Trump is run out of town.
Yeah, yeah. Redge, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Typically, if you want to know what the world's wealthiest people are thinking, you typically go to Davos, or you do the more sensible thing. You take a look at where capital flows are in the capital markets. You look at where bonds are being hedged, and that gives you a sense of where the world's wealthiest think opportunity lies and how and where they think the risk lies and what the balance between that opportunity and risk is. And that's typically how we get a sense of where the world is finding itself. A spanner in the wheels has been Donald Trump. Is once again approached global economics with a strong man mentality. Tariffs on most of the world, abducting presidents, and threatening to annex an entire country. And now the world has to respond to that. And this isn't a question of capital markets and bonds. This is a question of alignment and sensibility. Is Davos the right place to find a balance on that?
Thanks for having me. Well, it is supposed to be the place, but I'm afraid it's not right now because Davos, or World Economic Forum, is a neoliberal infrastructure intended, quite frankly, to propagate neoliberal ideas. And with power being exerted by Trump, and I suppose even some of the other Western governments or economies, that's not the place really where we can find balance. And I think as we see, Donald Trump has appended the entire trade regime, global trade regime as we've come to know it, and he continues. And I think going forward, this is going to be very disastrous, not just for the US, for the entire global economy. And to go to Davos and think that we're going to find solutions there, especially for the developing world, I'm afraid that is not a place where we can find that. But however, there's nothing that stops us from pushing and pushing as Africa and indeed the global South. To the extent that we continue to push, perhaps they're going to listen. But I'm afraid what economists do not normally factor in their discussions is the issue of power. And indeed, Trump is exerting it. So is the entire West. Should we find comfort? I'm afraid not.
Yeah, for Africa to keep pushing and pushing is the answer. Thokozile, we don't have a Davos equivalent for Africa or the global South. At best, I guess you could go to Abidjan and attend the CEO forum, and maybe you might bump into a head of state or two and hear them speak on a panel. But it doesn't at any point emulate a gathering where Africans and those in the global South think very deeply about their own economic power and position, how to mobilize their resources, how to collaborate effectively, and how to meaningfully claim their stake in the global economy. Is it about time that we perhaps in the global South boycott Davos and begin to really think about building platforms and forums where we can have those conversations seriously without the specter of the global North looming large over those who are still beholden to those checkbooks?
So I think the important thing to remember about these kinds of meetings is that it is the corridor conversations, the chat over coffee and the fancy lunches that the deals get made. And so there's a lot of noise and distraction around the big picture. And yes, there's a lot of uncertainty. And Trump world that we live in is something that economists tend not to like, which is uncertainty, because that can throw up all sorts of dynamics in being able to, try and predict what is coming further down the line. So if we strip away the noise and we strip out the Trump noise that we're having to deal with in the same way that we did this with South Africa heading up the G20, is that actually there's quite a lot going on the ground in terms of what Patrick is talking about, in terms of the neo-colonial mechanisms of supporting big infrastructure projects in the global South, making deals that are further around loans and debt and indebtedness for African countries in particular. And so we see this race to the bottom. So we see many countries on the continent having to try and vie for either the attention of the US and therefore garnering the billionaires' billions, or to avoid attention from the US. And so this creates very choppy waters that we have to navigate. But the conversations do take place, the deals do get made. And so what we need to be doing and tracking is, what are those deals? What do they look like? So if we listen to Team South Africa, for example, it's further privatization. As Redge said, this is a neoliberal project. It's about supporting the privatization of the provision of electricity in the country, the privatization of our rail and ports. And this is all kind of selling off the silverware, where in some respects, to model what has happened to Greece and other countries where they've had to completely privatize what is essentially their national wealth. And what Trump has done in Venezuela is to show that if you try and hold on to your own wealth as a country, you will be punished. And so South Africa faces this kind of dynamic of saying, well, if we were to, God forbid, keep our electricity quasi-public, subsidized, what kind of attention would that attract from America? So those, I imagine, are the conversations that are taking place in Davos, is how do we play this game in a way that doesn't have suddenly Ramaphosa, being helicoptered out of the country.
Redge, as I'm speaking to you now, the South African delegation and the heavyweights in them are currently having dinner in an event typically called South African Night. And this is where they invite external stakeholders to come and listen to the South African story. Part of that delegation is the Minister of International Relations, Donald Lamula, the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Parks Tau, the Minister of Electricity and Energy, Consentio Ramakopa, the Minister of Small Business for the very first time in an inexplicable way. Do the collective of them have a sense of how to sell the South Africa investment case? And is there a business case to make for the investability of South Africa right now in Davos, Redge?
Well, I think there is a case to be made for South Africa, and there are quite a few opportunities for the global elite, as you put it, to come and invest in the country. And I think this team that has gone there is sufficiently empowered and they've got facts on their fingertips to tilt the scales. But you see, I want to warn, however, that it's not necessarily the so-called FDI that we continue hunting that is at the center of the growth of the economies. It's not that. It's domestic economic activity or domestic investment that is at the center of any growth right across the world. However, we do need technologies, which is what I suppose DTI and other ministries that are there are going to be hunting for. That is important. Yes, so in short, South Africa's story is okay, and I think the players are good enough, and they know what it is that they're hunting, I suppose. But for me, what they should be leaning towards, if I were there, is to talk about exports, talk about technologies, not necessarily the FDI that we've come to see as a key talking point of saying, well, we don't have money, we need money from outside the country. Frankly, there is domestic money, but yes, it is a place where they can do it if they're smart enough.
Yeah. Prof. Bond, 30 seconds left. Is it at all possible to speak about a global economy and its growth without addressing the question of war and security?
No, and in fact, I'm, unlike my two colleagues, a little bit more pessimistic. I'm afraid that without that attention to imperialism, I think that's the proper name for this warlike stage of extreme capitalism that Trump represents, well, maybe our delegates to the Davos will be saying, like, to Portuguese slavers in the 1480s, or the Dutch Jan van Riebeck in 1650, or Cecil Rhodes in 1870, or the Oppenheimers and J.P. Morgan in the 1910s. Come on in, FDI. And that's the danger, isn't it? That the fetish to just bring in any global capitalist will reduce an attention to quality and to, indeed, the durability. We're sitting on top of what used to be half the world's gold here in Johannesburg. It's all gone, and we can't even keep our water pipes intact. So I'm a bit more worried than my colleagues about what our folks are going to be doing up there.
Prof. Bond, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Really do appreciate it. Thokozile Madonko, thank you so much for joining us. Really do appreciate it, as well as Redge Nkosi.